case study that she's going to share is her story. So she's going to share her experience, her story. So you won't be invited to give feedback on that because that's already happened, and the person who suffered is standing right here. So we don't usually do that, but you'll get a taste of a particular actual detailed story versus what I gave you as just sort of a broad overview. If, by any chance, you are interested in learning more about biblical counsel for eating disorders, you're interested in learning more about Krista's experience and how she walked through that, or we actually have a book, Table for Two, Biblical Counsel for Eating Disorders, is published by New Growth Press 2 years ago, I think. Anyways, you can look that up, and that gives more of it. Also, it's great for as a paperweight for a small stack of papers or a fly swatter, or so, feel free to make lots of purchases of it. So,
he's hilarious. But anyways, yeah, so I'm going to share my story while he passes out the handout. And yeah, so I'm basically just going to tell my story and then just share with you some common misconceptions about eating disorders. So the way that I often describe an eating disorder to someone who has never experienced one in their whole life or has no context for it is to imagine that you're drowning in the ocean at night and you're fighting to keep your head above water. Waves are continuously crashing on you, and your lungs ache for oxygen, but you don't know where to get it. You get twisted and turned around in the depths of the water so that you lose all sense of direction. You need someone to pull you to safety or you will drown. This is how I felt at the height of my eating disorder. I often felt like I was headed in the right direction only to get pushed back down again. And I was even so weakened by the effects of the disorder that it was hard to fight for myself. It was hard to think for myself. I was physically, psychologically, and spiritually unable to recover on my own. And so I needed help. And that's where a lot of people with eating disorders find themselves. So that's what we talk about a lot in this book, because this book is mainly set up to speak to a sufferer and a helper as well. So just a bit of my story is that as a child, I was very determined and perfectionistic. So a scenario that I often share is that, my mom especially would chuckle that I had to always have matching socks to my outfit. And I really remember one time going to, when I was in probably middle school, even at that point, my socks had been cream instead of white that I wanted them to be to match my shoes. And I had forgotten to bring some to change, and I just could not, stop thinking about that in gym class. It just totally, ruined my whole gym class. And I could watch other kids play, but I didn't want to join in until I completely figured out the whole scenario. I had to know all the rules. I had to know how another person was getting it right and winning so that I could join in and also win. And I lived in a small community and was very high achieving. I was sheltered and didn't really experience much tragedy, and life just generally went my way. So then as a teen, I was highly involved in sports. If there was a sport, I was going to try it and play it, and I had to be the best. I eventually became a valedictorian of my class. I was voted homecoming queen. So just all the ends of my life had to tie up, or I really just genuinely felt worthless. And so I could have all those things even and still feel just that ache inside of me that I'm not worth anything, nobody likes me, that kind of thing. So I had to keep just working and working at it in order to gain some kind of worth to somebody. So in college, things started to feel very much out of control. So in my small town, in my, small school, I could feel like I had everything under control. I had all the ends tied up. But college was just bigger and harder in everything. It just felt out of control. And my classes were definitely harder. I had been used to getting straight A's across the board, and I remember I got a C on my first English paper, and I was totally devastated. I didn't really even want to continue going to class after that, but and I couldn't seem to balance my studying time and social life. So there was just always, I wanted to be part of like my friends group and doing stuff, but I also really wanted to study and get good grades. So I felt like, but even after feeling like I was putting all this effort into it, I felt like I was constantly making all the wrong choices. I felt like every single choice I made was the wrong one, no matter what. And relationships weren't coming as easily to me as they used to. And I felt completely out of my comfort zone. So eventually I gained the freshman 15, that's the infamous weight that kids generally gain when they go away to college. And I just couldn't get rid of it because I had stopped playing sports. I wasn't quite as active, and there was food available all the time. So I just ended up gaining weight. And and that just like added another thing to everything else that felt like it was going wrong. And I felt like no matter what I was always disappointed in myself, and I couldn't fulfill all the great plans that I had for my life. And I kind of just started feeling like a hamster running on a wheel, like I was always running and always striving, but never really getting anywhere. So eventually I got really focused on losing weight because it was something that I felt finally that I was good at. It was like I could stop eating and I could start exercising more, and that was something that actually started to work. It was something that I could do, something that, even people would notice, and I felt like I was accomplishing something. But I didn't just stop at, a normal, like, stop eating so many desserts or, just cutting back a little bit. I just started drastically slashing my calorie intake and started eating less and less. I was avoiding meals and kind of making excuses to my friends, like I had a test to study for, or I just grabbed lunch in the cafe, that kind of stuff. And they didn't really ask a lot of questions because we were all busy. We all had, they all sounded like legitimate excuses. And I might have gone at that level for much longer if I hadn't experienced what some counselors call a tipping point. So something that really sent me past harmful thoughts and behavior and into a full-blown eating disorder. So the experience that, I call the tipping point was that I was driving home over Thanksgiving break, and I lost control of my SUV. There was a patch of ice, and my car slipped on it, and I wasn't an experienced enough driver to know not to slam on my brakes, and I did. And my car flipped upside down on top of a guardrail that was over, hundreds of foot ravine. Like, just thinking about it now, it just seems like an empty black hole. Like, it was really high up. And I knew that if my car went all the way over, I was definitely going to die. Like, there was no chance of surviving that. But by some miracle, my car came back down on all four wheels, and I had not a single scratch. My car was totaled, and I had lost some of my stuff that I was taking home. I had lost it out the back because the back window had busted out. But I was fine, but I could tell right away that kind of mentally and emotionally, I was not fine at all. I called my mom to tell her what had happened, and I was just kind of talking out of my mind, like saying really weird stuff that didn't even make sense. And a police officer had dropped me off at a gas station, and I was like just proclaiming the gospel to everyone that would listen. And like, I like sharing the gospel, but usually it's kind of a one-on-one thing, and I'm not like usually a, performer like that. And so I probably had gone through some kind of shock or something. And after that, I couldn't really seem to wrap my mind around the idea that I could have died, and that was completely out of my control. There was no way that I could have changed that. If it was going to happen, it was going to happen. So whether I lived or died at any given moment was out of my control. And that feeling of complete helplessness left me grasping for some form of balance. The world just suddenly felt really big and scary, and I just wanted something to hold on to. So it was shortly after that I went back to my apartment. I would imagine it was probably after Thanksgiving break had already was already completed, and I came back to my dorm room, and I was all alone in my room, and I ended up just eating absolutely everything, all the snacks and candy and everything that I had in my room, and I made myself throw up. But for a brief moment, I felt like I wasn't just like getting rid of the food, I was getting rid of all the anxiety that I had stored up for weeks. And it was like strangely terrifying to feel like I wasn't really doing that on purpose. It wasn't like something that I had planned to do, but at the same time it was soothing, but also very shameful. So I felt all those things all at once. But it also felt like a way that I had gained back control, that I felt like I had lost. But strangely enough, the more that I did it, the less control that I actually had over it, and the more it started controlling me. I was going to the gym multiple times a day. I was obsessively filling notebooks full of calorie intake. I just went through a cycle of restricting for long periods of time and then binging and purging. And I felt less and less like I could stop if I wanted to. So then following the car accident, I just found myself consumed by rules and rituals to the point that my whole belief system was affected. It just became the only thing that I thought about all the time. And I really would have stayed there much longer if I hadn't gotten help. There were times that I liked the way it made me feel, so I kept it to myself. I felt like I liked the control that it gave me. And even the feeling of being able to like touch the bones that were sticking out or feeling the thinness of my waist would assure me that I was okay in like a situation that I didn't feel control over. But a few things finally made me reach out and ask for help. Was that I was scared because like there were a lot of times it felt like I had said, I wasn't controlling it anymore. It was telling me what to do. And I was lonely because an eating disorder it puts you in isolation. Because when people start finding out about it, they want to help you. But if you want to hold on to it, then other people can't know about it. But it's also something that a lot of people can't relate to. So even if you wanted to tell someone, you would start to feel like, well, how would they ever, what would they think of me if they found out this is what I was doing? It was just very isolating. And the other reason was that I wanted to ask for help was that I had other things that I wanted to do. And sometimes that was like a very small glimmer of hope that I had that I was just like, this isn't the only thing that I want to do. I want to do other stuff. And so sometimes that would push me forward to tell myself I need to ask for help. So once I reached out, a process began that made it so that I didn't have to shoulder everything by myself anymore. And I could actually move forward at that point. But there were a lot of misconceptions that even the people who were trying to help me still had about eating disorders because they didn't know. Like, for a lot of people, this isn't something that they're really all that aware of. And so even the people who were trying to help me just had these misconceptions that it was hard for them to overcome in order to help me. So even some of the medical professionals that were on my care team had some really unhelpful and misguided ideas. We were just talking about this in the car on the way here, that I had gone to a gastroenterologist, and he had basically just told me to go home and eat some chocolate cake. And I was like, you don't understand what this is if that's what you're telling me to do. That's not helpful. So, and sometimes these really stalled my growth because it took time to get into those appointments, and then you show up, and then that's what you get, and you have to go somewhere else. So I just wanted to share some of these with you today in hopes that as you help someone with an eating disorder, you'll keep these things in mind so that they'll not hinder the growth of someone who's already having a difficult time. Like I said, it's already hard, to take those steps. It's already difficult, to find someone to help. And you don't want to hinder somebody from growing. So as I go along, you'll be able to pick up even some of the common motives and core issues of a person with an eating disorder, while also seeing some steps that are helpful for restructuring their life toward change. So that's some of the things you might pick up to help you with counseling. So, misconception number 1, an eating disorder is just a diet gone wrong. So an eating disorder is different from a diet for many reasons, but possibly the most important is that a diet does not lead to death. So eating disorders are among the deadliest of all mental illnesses, second only to opioid overdose. And so we all know how much people really push that help for people who are on opioids, but you don't really hear about eating disorders that much anymore. It's like eating disorders had their time in like the 80s and 90s, but it's still happening. The statistics are still the same now. They're not different statistics. So an article from Psychology Today states, people with eating disorders have a high risk of suicide, but in addition, the chronic malnutrition they suffer exacts a physical toll on the body. The combined mental and physical assault boosts the mortality rate from death by sudden heart attack, multiple organ failure, and other deadly consequences of prolonged malnutrition. 10,200 deaths per year caused by complications from eating disorders. So this comes to 1 death every 52 minutes. So nearly every hour of the day, someone is dying from an eating disorder. So if eating disorders were completely eradicated, just think about how many people would still be here on Earth. We do not have enough people being educated on how to help people with eating disorders. Apart from that, we possess a greater hope that most people struggling with an eating disorder will ever hear or experience. So 28.8 million people will suffer with an eating disorder in their lifetime. That's 9% of the population. So 9 out of every 100 people. And to varying degrees, it affects both genders, all ages, all races, and those from every socioeconomic background. Eating disorders do not generally get better without treatment. And so the DSM definition of an eating disorder explains the complexity of the issue. So an eating disorder is a pattern of destructive eating habits which significantly impairs physical health and psychosocial functioning. So it's not just impairing the physical health, but it's also impairing psychological function and just social interaction. And some of the common eating disorders are anorexia, is a form of self-starvation, bulimia, a cycle of binging and purging, binge eating, a compulsive consumption of massive amounts of calories at one time. And these behaviors serve a greater purpose than to just promote health or to lose weight like a diet would. They are usually just a deeper, there's like core beliefs and issues that go deeper than just that. So that's how they are different than a diet. So misconception number 2 is I will be able to see the signs of an eating disorder. So many sufferers are experts at hiding any signs of an eating disorder. And when you do actually see visible issues appearing, it's because it's already reached the point of, it's already reached a very critical point. And that's, the deeper you go into an eating disorder, the harder it is to break that cycle. And so by the time that you do actually see that something's going on, then it is going to be very difficult to help somebody to get out of that. So it's important to really not just be looking for physical signs of an eating disorder, but to be aware of just some of the actions that happen because of it. So, I have a long list here of other things besides just seeing somebody lose weight. Sometimes there's a concern just about eating in public. There's a preoccupation with weight, food, calories, like I was talking about just with my journals of, writing down calorie intake. And actually, kind of a symptom that you wouldn't think is actually an excess of energy. So I had counseled a woman one time who her eating disorder actually gave her an odd sense of just this extra energy at times that was, kind of perplexing. But there's excuses being made to avoid mealtimes, intense fear of gaining weight or being fat. And even when someone's dressing in a lot of layers to cover up their body, there's a refusal to eat certain foods. So what might just look like picky eating could actually be a sign of an eating disorder. So denying feeling hungry at all, or and just developing major rituals around food. So another one is, and I did this often, was cooking meals for others without eating it. So I had I owned a lot of cookbooks, and I was obsessed with learning things about cooking, but I'd want to make it for other people, and I would almost live vicariously through them eating it. So sleep irregularities, feeling cold all the time, thinning hair, muscle weakness, poor wound healing, those kind of things might be things that you start to really see physically. But prevention really could be an entire other presentation in itself, but really I just want to mention a few things because, like I said, once all those things start happening, it's actually more difficult to help someone with an eating disorder. So prevention is really the best way to go. But so one way is just having open conversations, especially with children and teens, about their emotions and their experiences. So a lot of times when they feel like they can't, they have emotions that are out of control, or they feel like, they're not able to regulate emotions well, that can lead into something deeper. So and talk to children and teens about their bodies the way that God does, not the way that the world does. So not as idols, but as instruments to carry out ministry for God's kingdom. And talk about how our bodies are always deteriorating, but our service to God will last forever. And while it's important to take care of our bodies, they are just vessels in comparison to our soul, which is eternal. So just like that kind of conversation, and I say with children and teens, but just that can be conversations you have with adults as well, that to talk about their bodies in a different way. And avoid body shaming, not just of them, but of anyone, anywhere, at any time. So it's not just saying, oh, of course, we all probably know in this room, don't body shame children, but don't body shame other people where they can hear that, because that makes a difference too. And just talk about like how everyone is an image bearer of God that deserves to be spoken of with that kind of thing in mind. And sometimes using food as rewards isn't a great idea, or withholding food to be a punishment is not a great idea. But even when so maybe these aren't your own children or teens, but just like being able to talk to other people as well about the character qualities that you notice in them instead of their appearance those all can be multiple ways that we can be helpful to prevent things like eating disorders from happening. So 3, the motive of an eating disorder is always to be thin. So finding common threads are important in order to eliminate confusion. But if you latch onto the wrong one, you can cause harm to a person struggling with an eating disorder. So just assuming that they want to be thin and like running with that can be a real detriment to someone that you're helping with an eating disorder. So remember that motives are diverse and they're unique to each person. But there are several common ones that you can keep in mind. So the one that I talked about for myself was just control. I didn't feel like I had control of my life. And I really didn't feel like I had control after I had my car accident, because all those things that were happening, I couldn't control at all. And that is a pretty common thread to see in people's lives. So other motives include self-medication, appearance, and that can be physical, but that can also be like social, like how they how their character appears to other people. And that can be pride or self-punishment. But even if these things can be traced back to control, pride can seem like a selfish and arrogant issue, but at times it's really just reflecting a need to feel in control. So when you're prideful, you want to control your reputation and status or your own feelings about yourself, so that you place yourself higher than others. So there's a lot still that kind of still comes back to that control issue. But so for example, like self-medication, you're just wanting to kind of control, how you feel. Like if you self-medicate, you're controlling that issue. So self-medication can often be a reason that they're wanting peace. Appearance can be they're looking for acceptance. Self-punishment can be the removal of shame and guilt that may have just gathered up from something that happened in their life. Sometimes abuse or just things like that. But when they're putting something over God, they're not always doing it intentionally. So I think that was even a mistake that I made in the beginning of my eating disorder, of just thinking that I'm doing something sinful by I'm thinking about food more than I'm thinking about God, which is true, but it's not really helpful maybe to state that outright. You should work to arrive at that conclusion in a creative and sympathetic way. So it it's completely unhelpful to point out any of the motives, really, just directly. There has to be a more creative way of going about that. Motives are developed from a combination of suffering and sin. So after our book came out, I started really hearing so many just awful stories of people who were suffering from eating disorders. I remember one person was talked about that they were adopted as a child, and they got the poor quality food in comparison to the biological children who got the better quality food. And so this person just always felt like she didn't ever deserve to eat. So that obviously would be something very connected to suffering. And again, another story connected to suffering is a young girl who was sexually abused by multiple relatives, found comfort in eating, but had also been emotionally abused in relation to her body by her overweight mother. So she had such an extreme fear of getting fat. So there's just all these things that are, inner working in there that maybe I could have put mine more on the spectrum of sin, that those were ideas that I was thinking in my head. But it's a much easier door to enter through, to go through the door of suffering, to say, just have that come up in conversation eventually about, putting something above God, but to really just enter in that door of talking about the suffering aspect of it first can be a very helpful thing, especially in something like an eating disorder where, the eating disorder itself can start causing suffering in their life as well. But even if an eating disorder does come about through sinful choices, Christ shows compassion even for those that are stuck in sin. And we see that even, in the way that he interacts with the woman at the well. She obviously had a past that was full of sin, but he didn't, he addressed that, but he also showed compassion to her. And that's kind of the model that we want to show in all of counseling, but especially, as I'm talking about eating disorders. So number 4, misconception is education leads to transformation. So don't assume that telling the person how they are harming their body, that will change anything that they're doing, because oftentimes they don't care about that. And I'm not saying that information is useless in bringing about transformation, but it's just really not the most effective way to help anybody. The big thing is to ask a lot of questions, especially in situations where they are not at great physical risk. Just slow things down and take time to really know and understand the person. This is how Jesus reached out to people. So some things you can ask are, when did this start? What's the nature of the behavior? What impact has it had on you? Whether it be your health, social life, work, family. You can even ask them for a timeline of their entire life. Because as you can see from, me explaining who I was as a child and a teen, there are just some things you can start picking up on from that. And it's just a way to get to know the person and see that you're actually counseling a person and not a problem. And even ask them, what is your eating disorder doing for you? What benefit are you getting from it? Because even if it is causing them great harm, there is a reason that they started doing it. They are continuing it because it does actually do something for them. For me, it was just that relief feeling of just anxiety that would build up, or, so what benefit really is it giving to them? And ask about their food rules. This can often reveal their motive because it shows what they are hoping to get from the behavior and how far they are willing to go to get what they want. it also shows you how deep they are into the eating disorder. So you can ask about relationships and look for any signals that might indicate any type of controlling or difficult relationships with their family members or intimate partner. Relationships can hold the key to a lot of information. And that doesn't have to be, directly talking about the eating disorder, because sometimes they're a little reluctant to talk about that. So relationships are kind of a good way to get information as well. So questions not to ask can be things like, do you realize how hard this is on your family? And this just puts the burden on the sufferer. And I know why people ask that sometime or say that. It's just to kind of snap them out of it and say, your family wants you to get better. But that kind of thing really just puts a burden on the sufferer and doesn't really move anything forward very much. And even, don't ask the question of why are you doing this, like outright. It doesn't really, they're probably not going to know the answer to that. So the answer to this question will have to come through asking better questions about their life, patterns of behavior, and events that leading up to the onset. So another thing, as you're counseling someone with an eating disorder, is to try to relate to some part of their struggle. So most people will say, like, I have no idea what that's like. I've never struggled with that, and I don't know what it would be like to go through that. But so you may not understand how a person could avoid eating for days at a time, but you may be able to relate to wanting to have control over difficult emotions. So try to just understand the feeling that you have. Try to understand the feelings underneath the concern, instead of trying to understand the manifestation of the concern. So just some things that maybe you do when you're struggling with emotions might be to take a hot bath or sing loudly in the car when their thing is just, restricting their eating or eating a lot of food and getting rid of it somehow. Like it's really just, it's on a spectrum of things, but you can at least maybe relate a little bit of if you have something that you go to when you have difficulty with your emotions. But what works for you to control your emotions may not be as destructive, but chances are you have something that you rely on to help you to control your emotions. So you can connect with them on that level. With eating disorders, like I said, suffering should be the entry point most of the time, which can be hard when you're sitting across from, because you could get a very belligerent teenager who has been searching websites that tell her how to have an eating disorder, because those are things that are out there. So, for example, if a person has a condescending and judgmental attitude, but they were also sexually abused as a child, then talk to them about the sexual abuse before you start coming down on them about their sinful behavior. And I can say that because that was an actual scenario that I faced as a counselor. One of my first counseling experiences was helping someone with an eating disorder, and I thought it was a good idea to address the pride and the judgmentalism that this person was showing when I just, I totally walked past that she was abused as a child. And so it's really important to go through the suffering door instead of automatically going to the sin door. And it's not that you won't address that at all. It's just, wait until you've established some rapport with the person. So misconception number 5, only college girls have eating disorders. So there is becoming a higher prevalence of eating disorders in men. So the statistics show that 1 in 4 people diagnosed with an eating disorder are male. So it's still higher in the women, for women, but as you can see, that's 25%. That's still on the charts. So this statistic seems to be on the rise for a couple of reasons. Just the healthy body image has been pushed with women, but our society is still stuck on making muscles the marker for masculinity. So, there are commercials out now that just show all types of women and all types of body types because they've seen how that affects women to see that constantly. They've started pushing a better body image, but that's not really happening for men. It just seems that we're still stuck on just showing that muscles and, like I said, are just a marker for masculinity. So, though it might look a little different, the wrong ideas of masculinity are even being pushed sometimes in Christian circles as well. It's not just like on TV. It's just that conquering, go out and fight kind of mentality can just not really be all that helpful for someone who might tend towards struggling with this. So, and to say things like, this is how a man looks and acts, instead of, this is an example Christ gave to us, can confuse a Christian man about his identity. So it's just important to keep an eye out, not just among girls and women, but among boys and men as well. And another category that I've noticed prevalence is in middle-aged women. So contrary to what some believe, people don't actually really grow out of an eating disorder. They usually just get better at hiding it and normalizing their behavior as they get older. So a bulimic college student, there are just factors to that it's like a brand new thing. It's suddenly causing issues where they, might need to go to the doctor. So these statistics are getting put into the categories. There are many more college students because of that. But a 40-year-old woman, like a stay-at-home mom, she's eating alone a lot. She's, she's just learned ways of hiding her behavior that maybe a college student hasn't or doesn't have the chance to. There's also a prevalence in children. In an article posted on the Harvard Health blog, there has been a notable increase in eating disorders among children and teens after the pandemic. So we're actually seeing another rise in eating disorders because of the pandemic, as it caused a lot of things to go awry. So when children feel that their world is out of control, they'll turn to something that they have control over. And so I've heard recently too of prevalence in people who have medical conditions. So this is something I'm still doing research on, but it was brought to my attention by some very inquisitive medical students at a church that I spoke at in Virginia. But she was just talking about how those with diabetes or with certain food allergies, they have to restrict foods, intentionally, but then it can turn into something more aggressive than that, because it's hard to keep that line balanced of, I am supposed to restrict, but I can't restrict that far. And so it just kind of, it's easy if they experience a tipping point just to fall over into that. So, number 6, eating disorders should be treated the same as every other addictive habit. So eating disorders do often get put in that category of addictive habits because they are, but one major difference is obviously what makes an eating disorder so tricky is that you cannot cut food out of your life like you can drugs or alcohol. So you have to continue to live with the thing that is tempting you the most. And so it is a very difficult one to overcome because of that. So it's not about creating less destructive rules. It's about resisting the need for rules at all in order to see that we can never have the kind of control we are looking to have. It's about recognizing the safety we have in trusting a sovereign, powerful, and loving God. It's about developing a healthy relationship with food as fuel for our bodies, as a means for thanking God and enjoying his creation, and as a gift, not an idol. So while other addictive habits and substances can impede your work for the Lord and your participation in the kingdom of God, food can actually empower you when you use it properly. So those are just some ways that you can, speak to somebody, especially in that area of struggling to figure out, okay, how do I live this balance with food in my life? So it's important to understand each person's particular food rules and their function. So they can be for like a false security, to know that there's something that I can always count on to be true, something I can always have control over, and to understand their unique triggers. Another issue that you really can't remove from daily life. So they may have these type of triggers that happen, but so some of mine were like, I have to get weighed at the doctor. Like, it's part of what they do. But I can say I don't want to know how much I weigh, or I can be weighed turned around backwards so I don't see it. And it's just about making the doctor aware of that stipulation. And another trigger was that you have to see other people eating. So how do you kind of reconcile with that? That's a difficult thing. And sometimes that's just changing just the cycle of thoughts that are in a person's head, like as they're seeing other people eating. So one of mine was just that it would drive me crazy to watch particularly my brother eat, because he didn't really think about what he was doing with his food and it would just be messy and everything. But I just had to start really thinking of him just more, as an image bearer of God, that that's not something that should keep me from having a relationship with my brother. And, just really thinking more deeply about relationships than I did about my rules. And then another one is that I had to put on clothes. So that sometimes is another trigger that, I had a friend who had an eating disorder, and when she would pull her jeans out of the dryer, we all know they shrink a little, and that moment would just give her a little bit of a panic. And so just having some things that will help in those scenarios are really important. So then just figuring out what to do about social media, diet talk, feeling overwhelmed and sensing expectations. Those things can't be stopped, but they can. You can change your thought patterns about them. So, number 7, if someone has an eating disorder, they must have a history of trauma. So that's sometimes a misconception. So the harm in assuming trauma when it maybe didn't really happen is that you could miss the other issues they're struggling with, and you could unintentionally suggest things to that person that would not have come up naturally. So I had a counselor who was just pretty insistent on that something must have happened traumatic in my life before, like when I was a child. And so I felt like I was really digging into things, and your mind can be very pliable. And so you start to think, did that happen? I don't know. I think so. Maybe something really did. And so it's never a good idea to really suggest trauma if it's not naturally coming up. But there certainly is not one correct path to take in counseling, but it should just flow organically from open-ended questions. So that's a safe way to go about that. But on the flip side, there is harm in ignoring trauma as well. 1 in 4 people with an eating disorder have experienced trauma. So that's where the misconception comes from, is, that 25% of people. So it's not, trauma isn't completely absent from the conversation, but people have been through something traumatic and don't know how to deal with the resulting feelings and physical reactions. Then sometimes they'll turn to something, like an eating disorder. So some of the issues that you could miss if you're just focusing on trauma is that this idea of comorbidity. There are 50% of people with an eating disorder who have abused drugs and alcohol, compared to 9% of the general population. So they could also be struggling with drugs or alcohol. 63% of bulimics have major depression, and 50% of them usually carry that through their entire lifetime. There is prevalence of anxiety and social phobia. 35% of people with anorexia and 44% of people with bulimia struggle with OCD. So you can kind of see some of that stuff in my description of myself in in my early years of just that need to have everything in order. So there are just various things to which you could miss if you're just saying, oh, it must be the trauma. There could be other conditions that are lying under. So misconception number 8 is, if I'm close to someone with an eating disorder, it's my job to save them. So as a friend, family member, pastor, or counselor, it's not a good idea to assume that you will be providing the majority of the care for someone with an eating disorder, especially when it's gotten to the point of being very harmful. The people that really should be on that team, like I was talking about before, there should be medical professionals that can monitor things that you shouldn't be monitoring. There should be someone who knows something about nutrition. That's not something you should touch as a counselor either. So part of your job might be just helping that person gather a team of people to help them. Because we don't often counsel people, or we don't at all. We refuse to counsel people who refuse to seek nutritional care because it's not safe. Like it's really not safe or people who have not sought medical care and can actually prove that to us. Like, because it really isn't safe to counsel someone with an eating disorder without those things in place. Because there could be so many underlying things that can be hidden, like I talked about before, just the mortality rate from heart attack, organ failure, those type of things don't show up in a physical appearance. An eating disorder is a complex issue that requires comprehensive care. Medical care should be top priority. That includes a primary care physician, a nutrition specialist, and possibly emotional, psychological support, and spiritual care. So that's where we would fall. When providing spiritual help, you may end up being kind of the last line of care. So while your care is vital, it might not be the most prominent, and that's really okay. So I think that's a hard line to stay behind, because you want to see somebody get better, but you have to really think of yourself more as the support rather than the first line of care. Let's see, I already said all that. Eating disorders can really affect so many parts of your body, and these type of symptoms can be hidden, but are much easier to deal with if treated early. So one thing that, just a biblical aspect of that kind of self-care, we see in 1 Kings 19 when Elijah needed physical care before receiving instruction from the Lord. There is a need for a person with an eating disorder to look to their physical care before taking any other action. So let's see. My time's running out. I didn't want to. So number 9 is you might not be focusing really on food. So it's not really about eating necessarily, but it's more about, what am I thinking when I put this in my mouth or when I don't put it in my mouth? What am I thinking about myself? What am I thinking this will give me? What do I feel before and after? And it's kind of about slowing down the process and seeing where God fits in the picture. Thankfulness can be a big category of just, that awareness that God has given us a gift that we should be thankful for. And ultimately, food issues can be a worship issue as well. It's much more about making God bigger and food smaller, because otherwise you've just created more rules for them to follow. Let's see. Yeah, and then so you'll want to establish a better awe and worship of God, and then move food back into the picture as a way of displaying obedience. So you first just work on that aspect of knowing and loving God. And then, like I said, food can just come back in as a way to show that you, just showing the obedience that you are now showing to that God that you've learned about. So one assignment I had given to someone was to, there was a piece of cake that she really wanted and just couldn't seem to make herself eat. And so I just said to get the cake and just eat, even if it's just one small bite, and just do it with all the thanksgiving in your heart that you can muster. So even if it's just the one bite, like, do it with as much thanksgiving as you can. So let's see. I'll just move on from that. So one thing I did want to address was just that there's a huge factor of shame that's involved in a lot of these motives. So even pride, if you're seeing that displayed, is an idea that you want to resist shame. So Hebrews 12:2 says, "Looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God." So when you see that shame in their life, there's just that idea that Jesus came and despised the shame. And so they don't have to live with that. So the last thing was just that there was one more misconception, but I'm just going to skip that for now. And I just wanted to say, where am I at now? So my struggle, I consider, I would say I'm free from it. I would say, I often say I'm in recovery from it, or whatever the verbiage that I use. But I also often say that eating issues are still in the background of my heart. So body image still creeps up on me sometimes. But I know I now have the tools that I can use when I'm in a difficult situation. And I think that's a big idea that counselors need to follow, is just making sure that people have those tools that they can fall back on. So the phrase that has become my motto is that Christ lived a perfect life so that I didn't have to. And that has just changed a lot of my thinking. So, that's all I have. I'll close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I just thank you for just the way that you've used my experience with an eating disorder to help other people. And I just thank you for giving me the words to say tonight, and I pray that it will be helpful to people who want to counsel people with eating disorders in the future. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.